Welcome to Now for Someone Completely Interesting. I'm your host, Ben Poulin. My guest today defines one of the main reasons why I was compelled to do this show. I've known Derrick for about 5 years now through hockey, and the only time we've ever conversed is when he's chirped me after scoring on me. And then about a month ago, while we were on a test drive as I was trying to sell him a truck, we actually had a conversation. And as long as I've known Derrick, I thought he was just a farmer and part-time employee at the local hunting and fishing store, which is Warehouse Sports here in St. Paul. Well, that day I learned he had a whole other career and a degree in archaeology with a focus in underwater archaeology. And when I asked, how does an Alberta prairie boy get into that? He said, well, that's an interesting story. So I said, well, I know just the place to share that story. So I'm pleased to welcome the leading scorer and penalty minutes leader for the St. Paul Pros hockey team, Derrick Plante.
It's very apt indeed.
And those stats, we don't actually keep stats, so I don't know who's going to challenge us on that, but it's my podcast and I can say what I want.
Sure, I'll go with it. I'm pretty dirty out there, as dirty as they come when it comes to hockey.
And I know you've potted a few. I've been victimized in that regard as well. So, but thanks again for agreeing to do this. And I know it was a busy time for you with the farm. So it's been a few weeks in the making here, and already learning something about beer, which I thought I knew everything about. But
yeah, well, I learn too all the time. I'm always open to trying something new.
What are we calling this? You've introduced me to a new concoction with beer.
Yeah, well, when I was in school, we called it the Pink Mist.
Okay.
Pink Mist, yeah.
And it's a couple of different Wild Rose products that are meshed together, and so far it's going down pretty good. So hopefully it doesn't go down too good before the end of the podcast, and we can get through this with some sobriety.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. As I mentioned, Derrick, so archaeology, I mean, when I hear that word, I'm thinking of something on a grander scale, like maybe like Indiana Jones or something like that, or at least in the very least, the only thing I'm familiar with that kind of a career is things like watching documentaries on TV and docuseries and that such. I've never actually met a real archaeologist, so definitely going to get there, but let's start maybe a little bit earlier on in life. You grew up in St. Paul, correct?
Yes, I did, just north of town.
Grew up on the farm, and when you say just outside of town, it's like right on the line.
Just outside of town. I had the best of both worlds growing up.
There you go.
I could walk to get a Slurpee, and I could have all the quads and motorbikes that I could get my hands on. It was a good place to grow up, that's for sure.
Right, so grew up in St. Paul, went to school here as well?
That's correct.
Which school did you go through?
I was elementary reset, regional.
Right on. So where did what brought you in the direction to go into archaeology? Like, I can tell you for myself, I'm fascinated with history and things like that. And if there's a show on TV that has anything to do with archaeology, I'm into it. I never had the idea that was something that you could actually get into for some strange, maybe because I wasn't smart enough, but where did it like, and there's not a lot of archaeologists out there. So how did you find even the program to get into? Okay,
so let me unpack a little bit here, because there's a little, like, you're talking about smart enough, and it's like, well, there's a story behind my education too. But we'll start with, like when I was a kid, we didn't really have TV. We had antenna TV. If you're lucky, you got 2 channels and they were fuzzy. So like TV wasn't something I watched a lot as a kid, but the local library, I was always taking out VHSs, because, I'm dating myself with VHSs. Maybe not as bad as some, but I would always take out VHSs on stuff like history, right?
Yeah.
I like learning about that stuff. And my parents noticed from a young age too that I would sit in front of the TV watching Discovery and that kind of stuff. I was always very interested in it. I think the biggest part of me was that being in a French school probably helped too, but I got into Tintin really early.
Okay, yeah.
By Alger. And that was, there's a couple books. There's The Secret of the Unicorn and then Red Rackham's Treasure, which is basically him going on an adventure to find a sunken ship. And I've watched that show countless times. I remember as a kid at the librarian was saying, okay, well, you've had the VHSs for those for too many weeks in a row. Like, you have to let someone else be able to borrow it, right? And that was never anything that no one was there. It was just me that was really watching this stuff.
Yeah.
So I mean, from that point on, like I always knew that that was something I was interested in. But growing, like I wasn't exactly a very like school kid. Probably had some form of ADHD. Probably never been diagnosed or anything.
Right.
But I was kind of in big classes when I was a kid. I was in a class of 32. It was pretty standard class size for going all the way through. And I was kind of missed on my phonetics. Went through school without really knowing that letters have sounds.
Right.
So that's really doesn't help. Like when our education system is very based on reading. You need to be able to read to be able to understand the question, to answer questions or anything really. Mm-hmm. But I was lucky that in grade 10 I was caught by a teacher of mine when I was younger, Patricia Gervais. I believe Patricia's her first name. I always called her Mrs. Gervais, but she was doing some schooling or whatever to catch students that had this reading problem. So I was the kind of person that couldn't read out loud. If you put a thing in front of me, I would just read one word at a time. It'd be kind of slow, and then that's not uncommon. There's a lot of people that have different spectrums of that problem, but she knew that I had this very specific problem. So I ended up taking a course that was made for a grade 2 student in grade 10, which was, they kept it a bit of a secret because they thought it was a little bit, embarrassing, I guess would be the right term to do this, right? But I was kind of a 50, 60s percentage student. That's what I was.
Right.
Halfway through grade 10, I became an 80, 90 student.
Wow.
From taking this course, and I was able to read. At the time I was taking COM, and I mean, we can talk about whether COM is a useful class or not, but one of the things that the teacher did was popcorn reading.
Right.
Where, someone reads and then they jump to the next person.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden the other kids in the class figured out, well, if they just give it to me, I'm just going to read the whole thing and I won't pass it on to anybody. It was kind of like this moment where I was like, this is the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me. And I would just keep reading and I wouldn't stop and I wouldn't pass it on. So once I got into high school, all of a sudden I did this course, and all of a sudden university was an option all of a sudden. It was never something I really thought of. Other than I was focused on, and even when I finished high school, I wasn't really thinking, I'm probably just going to stick around home. And I took a year off because I was in the same thing. Like, how do you get to an archaeology degree? But I had parents that were very adamant about going to school.
Yeah.
So I ended up applying for a few different schools, like Augustana. It's a religious one. I can't remember the name of it, in Edmonton. And then McEwen. Is that the one in Edmonton?
McEwen, yeah.
And I got it into all three. But Augustana stood out like completely. Coming from a small town, it was small field. The way that the people who I was talking to, showing around, really interact with me really well. So I ended up going to Augustana for 2 years and I never declared my major because I took a lot of history. I took some philosophy. I really focused on, I had a good history teacher who really helped me figure out how to write properly. I mean, when you're so far behind and how to just read in general, understanding flow of sentences is something that's not easy to do. So I got caught up in my first 2 years. I mean, I also spent 2 years partying. I mean, that's how university is, I think, for most.
That's right. Well, yeah.
Then all of a sudden the door opened that, hey, well, you have a good enough GPA that you could go to U of C and do some archaeology if you want. So
so you said you went to Augustana, you didn't declare a major, but was archaeology kind of was that on your mind?
At that point, no.
Okay.
It was only after, like, basically in the last semester of my second year that I was talking to a history professor, and it's like, well, because I'm trying to figure out what I want to declare for my major. And he's like, well, what do you want to do? And I'm like, well, I've always been interested in archaeology, like ever since I was a kid. That's what I wanted to do. And he's like, well, go do that. Like, we transfer here because at that time that I went to was just became U of A.
Right.
The system that they used to convert over to a major university was pretty much the same for U of A and U of C. So I needed a 2.0 GPA, which I was above that. Like, that's like considered 50%, right, on a university scale. And they're like, yeah, why don't you just go do it? So made the big decision to go jump into archaeology, and I have some family there, so I got to live with family in Calgary. And within the first 2 weeks of school, it was, yeah, this is what I was meant to do, always meant to do.
Is there a lot of options for schools for archaeology specifically, or is Calgary kind of one of the few, or was it just more of maybe the closest to?
Yeah, I think family's always been a thing for me. Like when I first moved away to do my first job, it was about, I don't know, 9 hours away. And that's a bit far when you want to come travel for a weekend or something. So family was kind of important to me at the time. So, I mean, there's a few universities across Canada that does archaeology. Sorry, I'm just getting a little...
No worries.
But Calgary to me was, I had family there. I get along really well with that family. So it was just kind of a natural, let's go do that.
So how long of a program is it then once you're into archaeology?
Well, basically any degree is 4 years.
Right.
Me coming into it so late, I took an extra year to increase my GPA because at that time I was really focused on going to grad school.
Okay.
That was after I went to Europe and did some work there and did some touring, and I was like, okay, like this is definitely the career I want to pursue, and I want to get to a higher level to be able to work on projects more than just volunteer because I mean, archaeology, as glorious as it sounds, it's not exactly the best paying.
And that's job. That's what I was going to ask, because I've learned that when my kid was really into dinosaurs, and we go down to Drumheller and the paleontologists. Well, there's one paleontologist and 50 students doing all the grunt work, if you want to put it that way.
Yep.
And
we call them shovel bums, is what we call them.
Yeah, not making much money, if any money, at that point. It's So archaeology, I'm guessing now, is kind of the same.
I mean, they're very different fields of study.
I guess what I'm saying is like the hierarchy of it is like you really have to pay your dues before you.
Probably. I mean, yeah, I couldn't really say.
Okay.
That's not part, like dinosaurs I know nothing about.
Right.
It's like that is not
what I know. That's not what I'm saying. It's saying like it's a very unique, both are very unique in their own way. But it's like you come in as a student and there's the top archaeologist that's running the show and getting all the recognition for the discoveries. But what you said, the shovel bums are.
I mean, any excavation, like as much as like on TV where they have the head archaeologist or the head excavator talking and showing you around. I've been in that supervisor position. I've done that standing around and watching other people dig. It's a great job for sure. But I mean, yes, most of the work is actually done by the people who are either volunteering or taking minimum pay to do that. I mean, that is the fun part, though. As much as it's fun to be able to oversee an archaeological dig and pay attention, be able to go to this part versus that part and what's going on here and what's going on there. Getting in the dirt of it is definitely the most adrenaline-filled thing. Finding stuff is always the part that's exciting, right?
Now, as I mentioned in the intro, you have an archaeology degree with a focus on underwater archaeology.
That's correct.
When you're focused, so when we're talking about that, I'm instantly thinking oceanic or something like that, which might not necessarily be the case. I guess there's archaeology to be had in our local lakes and rivers if you were so inclined. But yeah. I guess in general, though, what would that entail as underwater archaeology? Because I mean, we talk about it. You're digging through the dirt, so to speak. How does it work with water? Like,
water is very, like, I mean, there's several different examples I could tell you about, but basically, underwater archaeology for the most part is done via scuba diving. For the most part, there are odd exceptions, and yes, it doesn't have to be in the ocean. It can be in a river. It can be in a lake. It can be in a swamp or a bog. It doesn't have to be specifically the ocean. I'm very much a ship guy, but I also like wherever I am, I try to learn as much as I can about the surrounding environment. So as far as my focus is, I want to really preserve archaeological material. There's a ship in Sweden called the Vasa, which I don't know if you've ever heard of it or not, but they a grand story about this king who really wanted this really fancy ship, and all of his shipbuilders, like, if you build this thing, it'll sink because it's not seaworthy. He's like, no, it's got to be built this way. It's got to be built this way. And it didn't even make it, half a kilometer out of the launch, and it tilted over. The wind blew it over and it sank. So that's really expensive, beautiful ship sank. And I don't know, this is really testing my memory, but 80 years ago or 70 years ago or something like that, they were doing some work at Stockholm harbor, and they came across this ship, and they actually brought it up. They brought it out of the ocean, and they used this PEG material to basically preserve it, because as soon as you take wood out of the water, like you've probably seen wood before, it feels heavy.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of it's been replaced by basically water. As soon as it dries out, it starts to fall apart.
Right.
So they use this PEG material at the time to replace the water with this stuff so that it would keep its molecular cohesion. But even over time, that's starting to degrade. So the ship is literally starting to sag under its own weight. It's sitting in a museum in,
Right.
I believe, Stockholm. I'm not 100% sure, but somewhere's in Sweden that they have this thing sitting. And that's one of the things now. It's like, well, how do we preserve it further? So the thing is, stuff in the water tends to last a lot longer because it's anaerobic. There's no oxygen. There's no organisms that are as they're not metabolizing as quick.
Right.
So degradation of anything underwater is usually pretty slow. So I learned pretty quickly that as much as it's nice to remove stuff, it's probably better to leave it in place,
Right.
find a way to secure it until the technology comes about that, we can take this out and it's going to last indefinitely.
Right.
It's a field that I don't think is very widespread as far as archaeology goes. Like, I wouldn't be taking another degree in archaeology. It'd be in conservation.
Right.
So you're branching out for something else, right? But I mean, here locally, like, no matter where you are, how people moved and how they got around is always interesting.
Right.
As far, like, if you're inherently interested in archaeology, you'd be surprised at where you live, what you can find.
Right.
And I mean, without a keen set of eyes and probably some sort of education, you would probably walk by several artifacts and without even knowing.
Right. Well, you've had, I think you had, when we first talked about this, going back to that test drive, you had mentioned somebody had shown you a piece of...
Yeah, so Flat Lake.
Yeah.
I have some family that farm out there, and they sent me this picture, I don't know, three or 4 years ago, of this projectile. We call it projectile point, but
Right.
a projectile point could be anything from a spear point to an atlatl dart point to an arrowhead.
Right.
We call them projectile points, but basically show me this projectile point, and I'm like, oh, that's really cool. I'd like to come see it. And so I went to his place and he showed it to me, and it's just one of those things where it's like, okay, well, this was a spear point, approximately 4 inches long, and it was made out of material that we know is sourced in South Dakota.
Wow.
So it's traveled pre any terrestrial domesticated animal. It's traveled from South Dakota to northern Alberta, and the amount of hours that put into making a point of that, it's amazing that they found it in an agricultural field and it was intact. Just a beautiful piece, and the hours put into it, and then that it's at least 10,000 years old, or 9 to 12,000 years old. It's just mind-boggling that people were up here when glaciers were melting.
You know what else is mind-boggling is you're able to tell us that much about it by looking at it.
Yeah.
So I guess that's okay.
I mean, that's what I was taught, right?
I know, and
it's like second nature to me.
And that's where I'm going with this question. So you obviously, with the background, this is how they teach you. So what are some of the things that you learn in school that allow you to, I guess, pull this information that quickly from just looking at a piece like that?
Well, I mean, not everybody is good at every part of archaeology. Some people are good at anatomy and looking at human bones, and some people are good at lithics, which is rock tools and stuff like that. I definitely have a good grasp of lithics.
Okay.
That most people, once they get out of school, don't have. My first job, I was actually cataloging lithics, which they don't let people with my experience do.
Right.
So I kind of moved up the echelons in the field really quickly because I just had a knack for that part of it. I mean, I know I can tell you what human bones are and stuff, but I I'm not the one to tell you that, okay, well, this person had this disease and they died at this age. It wasn't the information that retained with me.
Right.
It's not where my interest was.
But you would still go through that process and learning that kind of stuff through school.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Okay. I mean, you can kind of choose there's a lot more courses that you can take than what you're going to take in a 4-year program. Like the way that I have to say it, and I did my 4-year program in 3 years because I did 2 years of undeclared studies before. So when I moved to Calgary, all I did was archaeology.
Right.
I didn't do science. I didn't do any of because you have to have kind of a route education. They make you take English and a few science courses, some history stuff. It was all done. So I was just in archaeology mode for 3 years. So I just took in as much information as I could. I don't think you really know how much you like learning until you're put into an environment that's like, this is exactly what I wanted to do. You just soak it up like a sponge.
So you get the archaeology degree, and you did work in that field, as you alluded to here in a few different avenues. What were some of the jobs you had after you earned your degree?
Well, after I earned my degree, I only had one job. I did 2 years. I actually didn't even look for a job. It came to me.
Okay.
I had a professor that told a company out of Cranbrook that you want to hire this guy. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how they got my number or anything. All of a sudden I get a phone call out of the blue from this guy saying, hey, I'd like to hire you. And I was like, I'm not even done my degree. Like, how do you know about me? So that was, like when you get approached that way, it's like, okay, well, I'll go take the job. So I moved to Cranbrook, but I lived in Kimberley.
Right.
And basically there, you're basically going out and trying to identify archaeological sites prior to disturbance, either forestry, mining, like coal or iron ore, even at something simple, because BC is structured a little differently. Like if they think that there's archaeological potential where someone wants to build a house,
right,
or any kind of other, development, a supermarket or something, that we can be called in to look at stuff.
Right.
So there I did a couple of human remains reclamation projects when people disturbed and all of a sudden skeletons were revealed. I did some work in that, and most of the time was just hiking. You drive to a remote location and you hike. Mm-hmm. And okay, this is the area we got to check out. Do you think there's potential here? We have to decide if it's worth putting a shovel in or not. We don't want to waste too much of their time because it's a extra fee, right? And it's not really, it's by government law there that has to be done. Whereas here it's completely different in Alberta. Right. But there it's like, if you find one piece of archaeological material, it's considered a site.
So how is this working then? You have to go in prior to a project starting and identify if there's archaeological potential. But is there any way that you could overlook archaeological potential, and then there's digging that starts and then some? Because in my mind it's like, well, we start digging and then we find something, then you call in the archaeologist to
I understand what you're saying. In Canada we didn't really have terrestrial settlements or right? They were very nomadic people.
Okay.
There are a few what we call long-term settlements in North America, but especially in Canada, well, as you go further south, you get closer and closer to people that lived in the same space for a long time. Right. But up here, they moved around. So generally what happens, and this goes back to what I said, like you could walk by a projectile point and you may not even know that's what it is. You might look at it and, oh, this is cool, but you might not even know.
Right.
So a lot of times of what we're finding is little pieces of rock, or, they were making a stone tool, let's say a scraper. Excuse me. They're making a scraper. They left all this refuse, we call it, which is just little chips off the stone, and we find that.
Right.
Especially little chips, no one's going to know what that is.
Yeah.
Right? We're able to identify that. So most of the time, if the archaeologist misses the potential, there's no one that's really going to catch it, unless something like really obvious comes up, right? Like ceramics or which we are finding some ceramics up here, but it's very, very rare.
Okay.
But the other thing too is going back to you were saying, sorry, that's my train of thought.
No, you've answered what I had, but it's like I'm saying it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. You're like looking on the surface, and telling people it's okay to dig, but how do you know it's okay to dig if you miss? But I get what you're saying too, is being nomadic and
there's
and moving around.
certain
There's no permanent structure, which would be
and like, for example, you could be in the middle of nowhere and find a projectile point, and chances are, if an archaeologist were crew to go and look, that might be the only thing you find,
right?
Because a hunter goes hunting, he shoots his bow, he misses, he can't find his point. Most of the time they would recover him because the amount of hours put in to make something like that, but sometimes they don't find it. So all of a sudden you can find a rogue thing and it's just a one-off. It does happen. So we look at a lot of different things, like, what does the landscape look like?
Right.
Is there things that would promote, like, oh, this being a dry location, this has the right sun aspect so that in the morning or whatever they get sun in the morning, or at night they want certain. We're looking for certain geological features that say, hey, we got nice proximity to a river, it's nice and high spot, let's put a few shovel tests in.
Right.
And most of the time when you're looking at these geological features, if you have 2 or 3 of them, you're finding stuff. Because people have lived here for 10,000 years. So there's stuff everywhere. People have been everywhere. Like, we like to think that, oh, well, we have no history. Something I hear a lot, it's like, oh, there's no history in Canada because we're such a young nation. It's like, there's history here. This part of the world's been here for as long as the rest of the world. It's just
maybe young in a conventional sense, but we know that definitely not in a
absolutely. Like, there's been people here for a long time, right? Like, as far as a nation, we're young, but to say that the land, just because it's not called Canada, there's been people here for a long time. So it's not like we're new. It's just Canada's new. So it's just an observation. Sometimes people say we have no history, and it's like, well, there's a rich history here. Yeah. It may not be what we consider European or ours, but it's still a history that's beautiful and should be paid the proper respect. For sure. Yeah.
No, that there's a lot of interesting facets to that I don't think I would ever think of. Like, I don't want to say stereotype, but for lack of a better word for archaeology, is like the digging and the investigating and this big thing, but this whole other aspect, and to think that a job in archaeology isn't working for some sort of government funded historical investigation, but you're actually working for a company to protect its own assets and interests and public relations by not disturbing something that shouldn't be disturbed is kind of an interesting aspect of it. Like, I mean, we hear, I guess it's like environmentalists working for the oil companies in a sense, or any resource company, is that you want to have responsible resource extraction. So you have an environmentalist to tell you the best ways. So now we also have the archaeologist.
Yeah, hopefully they're doing that, right? Hopefully they're not saying what the company needs to hear, because that is something that even in archaeological field does happen,
right? And I guess I get
right, like that opens a whole can of worms about ethics and stuff.
With these, money changes everything,
right? So, exactly. So I mean, if you got cleared by someone who can clear something, well, that's great. It's almost always better to have third party when it comes to those kind of things. Just then that way you're getting an objective and unbiased, for sure, reflection, right? But
so I know, I guess the other thing is too here. So you worked for a couple of years out in Kimberley for this company, and that's your one job you had in the field of archaeology. What made you decide to move on from that?
It was very situational with that company. So that's not a very big company at the time. When I got hired, they hired 3 new people, and the company was a total of 5. So it wasn't a big company, and they kind of brought us on because they weren't behind in specifically paperwork. The paperwork, there's a lot of paperwork.
Okay.
There is a lot of paperwork that needs to be done, and then the government requires like full, 600, 700 pages of everything you did, all amalgamated. So there's a lot of proofreading. There's a lot of going through stuff, make sure everything's written right in certain ways. So they kind of hired us on to be more, get them caught up. And within the people they hired were very good, because within 3 months or 4 months, we were kind of like caught up.
Right.
Whether we did a good job or not, I guess that would be the government to decide. But I don't know who reads that stuff on the other end. But I found myself in the winter not getting enough money, because it's very seasonal. You can't dig when the ground is frozen or underneath 5 feet of snow in the mountains or whatever, right? So
Yeah.
I just kind of I was happy there. There was nothing wrong with what I was doing. It's just I had an opportunity come up to start a business in Calgary, and I was like, well, I want to have, financial security. As much as I love archaeology, there is more to life than just going from season to season. So I was like, well, I'm going to go try to get myself financially secure so that I can go do my graduate.
Right.
And I don't have to worry about being, under more student debt.
Right.
I'd rather get ahead of it than get behind. So I decided it was a tough decision for me because I really enjoyed the work over there and the people. But it was like, well, it's time to move on and go try to do something else. That didn't work out, unfortunately, but business is that way.
Right. Is that when you ended up coming back home then to St. Paul?
No, I went back to Calgary for about a year and a half.
Okay.
Trying to start this business, and there's a lot of red tape when you're trying to to start a business. Let me tell you, way more than I thought. It was an experience, and pretty much my only fear is failing. So when that didn't go through because the landscape of what we were trying to do changed,
right,
and it was like, you know what, this is probably not a good idea to go forward with this anymore. It was hard. So I just came, and my dad needed some help harvesting since even I've been back. Like technically it was 6 or 7 years ago now that I came back and helped.
Right.
And the seasons were hard. Like he wasn't getting it all done and stuff. And I was like, well, I'm available, and they helped me financially try to get that business going. So I figured I'd come back and kind of pay my dues, and then I came back. And that's the thing about me. It doesn't really matter what I'm doing. As long as I'm learning,
right,
it's interesting. So like now I'm doing a lot of agronomy, which is like a whole different field completely. I look at a lot of chemistry and deciding, what crops need, what kind of options are out there. And I do a lot of agronomy for the farm, and then I met my significant other, and then I ended up staying. My plan was never to come back to St. Paul long term, but here I am now. It's like you said, you've been playing hockey for 5 years, and life's pretty good. Life's pretty good. I can't complain.
Well, the story of your business, and we're going to round things up here. That might be a whole other podcast too, because we got into a little bit about that, and I'm a little bit intrigued with how that one. It had to do with like gaming, correct?
Yeah, board gaming, board game cafe
yes.
is what I was trying to start up. Yes.
So and there's a whole phenomenon on that I've learned through some of my cousins that are into it, and then conventions and everything like that. So we might have to do this again sometime. But I'm definitely more educated on the idea of archaeology. I don't think we even really got too deep into it.
No, there's a lot of experience. Like you said, well, I only had a job for a year and a half. It's like there's a lot of experience that I had. There's field schools that I've done. There's work in Europe that I've done that we didn't even touch on, and some pretty cool stuff I did in Europe too.
Do you think there's any way you go back to it in some way somehow?
I think that like I really want to go get my graduate degree.
Right.
More so that when I am older and I'm a little bit more financially secure, I can go and volunteer on these projects in a leadership role. I don't, like you said, I don't want to be that person that 45, 50, 55 that's out digging. I want to be like, hey, you know what? Let's work on this project. These are my expertise. Bring me on and helping the project, right? And it being more of a hobby, something to do later in life than really a way to be financially secure.
And what's going through my head too, and when I ask that question too, is that I know you're here and the way life's gone, that you're happy with it. Your significant other, you have a family here now, but the fact that not far from here we find an artifact that's 10,000 years old. Like how much more is underneath us that's not explored, because we don't think of these little prairie towns as being deeply historical, but in fact they are, and there's more to it than that. So there might be a whole career in archaeology right in your backyard.
I have an artifact at home that my sister found, that there's only been one other found in North America.
Oh, wow.
And I brought it and I showed it to my professors, and by taking it out of where it was, I probably saved it.
Right.
It's what we don't really know what to call it. It's either what we would call a rasp or a spear point made out of bone.
Oh, wow.
So it is a pretty cool thing. Maybe next time you're around or come to my place, I can show it to you.
Yeah.
It's very rare, and it's found just 15 minutes away from here. So there's definitely some interesting stuff in our neck of the woods.
Well, hopefully people listening to this may start looking at the ground in a different way, and at what's in the soil, what's in the rocks on the trails and stuff like that. And if you need help identifying, now we know who to go to.
That's for sure. I'm willing to look at anything. But as long as you're not going to get heartbroken, because a lot of people pick up stuff and they think it's something, and most of the time it's not. So
it's the adventure, right?
It's the adventure. It's
right.
what you believe it is that really matters. It's the excitement it brings you.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks again so much. My guest here is Derrick Plante. Now, I know you've done some research on this podcast itself and listened to a few episodes, but I don't know if you've listened to ones that had the question at the end that's coming here. You're here on this podcast as someone, who's completely interesting. And if you had to recommend someone for this podcast, I'm not saying they would have to come on or anything, but just as someone who's completely interesting, who do you think should be on here?
Yeah, I did do a little bit of homework before I came and sat here today. And it was something that, being back, to be honest, like my life has been very focused on my family. So I haven't been going, and COVID is a big thing too when you're coming back. So like there's a lot of people, and because I changed so much, there's a lot of people that don't know who I am, right? They pass me in the street and know who I am. But there's some people that you've had on your podcast that I know very well, and I'm like, those are the people I probably would have said. I mean, I know that it's been repeated a few times, but Al Juvenville probably.
Oh yes.
From the farming and agronomical side, like I sell fertilizer to him, and that man he's been decades ahead of everybody else.
Right.
Eventually, farming is probably going to end up where he's at.
Yeah.
It's not there yet, but it's not far away. Farming's changing fast.
And it's funny because he was a name that popped in my head when I started doing this. And one of the reasons his son lives just a couple doors down from me. And we've talked about some of the innovations he's had with it, like, I mean, engineering innovations to harvest his carrot crop is genius. So, well, enough people do it. We might have to find a way to get him on here.
There is one other person I did think about. And just a story guy. Like every time I talk to this guy, he's always got something interesting. His name's Jim Workington. I don't know if you know him or not.
I don't think so.
I can put you in touch with him if you want. Well, I guess I could reach out to him first or whatever.
Sure.
But every time I talk to the man, he's got some story to tell me. He's lived across Western Canada, all over the place, and very nice man. Would be very interesting. I find him very interesting. So I don't know if that means anything or not.
Absolutely it does. And that's the whole point of the question. So of course. So, and that's what this podcast is all about. And especially for me is not only reconnecting and learning about people who I've recently met, but meeting new people altogether. So definitely would be interested in getting some contact there and seeing if he would be interested in that too and learning a bit more there. So once again, my guest here is Derrick Plante. If you've enjoyed this podcast, you can find us on your local podcast provider by searching Poolin Radio, or now for someone completely interesting. Please give us a like and please subscribe to the podcast. We'd really appreciate that. And once again, someone completely interesting, fascinating, all of the above, and just a hard-nosed hockey player who knows how to get under my skin. Not really. We have a really good time.
There's the real prairie boy right there.
There it is, yes. Once again, my guest here, Derrick Plante. Thank you so much.